Welcome back to U.S. History Lectures. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to dive into the Progressive Era. So there's several lessons in our textbook about various aspects of the Progressive Era. Today we're going to introduce ourselves to it and kind of do a thorough overview of what the Progressive Era was. So we've been talking a lot about the second half of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, political corruption, the life of a wage worker, and all of the problems that came with this huge industrial growth in America. And as a result of all those problems, it was followed by a wave of reform. And so the Progressive Era was this transformative period in American history where ordinary citizens pushed for major changes in society, democracy, and the government. So the goal is that by the end of this presentation, you'll understand the three key progressive goals: expand democracy, improve government efficiency, and fight for social justice. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So what was progressivism? It was a broad movement of reform that touched nearly every aspect of American life. It covers so many different categories. People who belonged to the progressive movement believed that the government needed to be more responsive to ordinary citizens' needs. They wanted to eliminate corruption, waste, and unfair practices in both government and business. And there were many different facets of progressivism, or I should say progressivists, and different groups focused on different causes. Some fought for worker safety, others fought for women's rights, others fought for a cleaner, a less corrupt government. Muckraking journalists played a crucial role in exposing problems and bringing them to public attention. And so there's a big push for journalism to bring to the public arena the issues that were happening so that they could be addressed. All right, so Robert, we're going to talk about a few different key movements and leaders of the Progressive Era. Robert L. Follett, also known as Fighting Bob. He was one of the most influential progressive politicians during this time. He was the governor of Wisconsin from 1901 to 1906. Look at that. We're finally getting into the 1900s. He introduced the quote Wisconsin idea, which was hiring experts to research and advise on legislation or the creation of laws. He championed or promoted workers' compensation, minimum wage laws, progressive taxing, and women's suffrage, which is the right for women to vote. They still did not have the right to vote at this time. He later served as a U.S. Senator and ran for president in 1924, and his approach showed how one state could become a model for democratic reform across the nation if we could just get more progressive people in office. So the direct primary. This has to do with how people vote. So before the Progressive Era, only convention delegates chose candidates for elections. Progressives pushed for the direct primary, which allowed ordinary party members to vote for candidates directly. Ultimately, today, 75% of the US states use the direct primary system, where ordinary citizens can vote in who's going to be up for a candidate for a political office rather than not having control over who their candidates are and only who they can choose from the pool of candidates. Say there's 3 candidates running for governor, they had no say over who those candidates were without the direct primary. The direct primary allowed the everyday person to cast a vote to choose the candidates. So the direct primary was adopted first in South Carolina in 1896. Florida was actually the first to use it for presidential nominations in 1901. And like I said, today, 3/4 of the country uses the direct primary. So permanent change here. Progressive groups also created 3 powerful tools to help bypass corrupt legislators and give power to voters. Okay. Initiative, referendum, and recall, fancy terms for direct democracy tools, trying to give more power back to the people voting, less power to the people already in power. The initiative that they promoted allowed citizens to propose laws by petition and place them on a ballot. So now everyday citizens, when working together in tandem, could actually propose a law rather than just the people who are already elected in office. The referendum let voters approve or reject existing laws through direct voting. The recall allowed citizens to remove elected officials through petition and vote. And by 1920, many states had adopted these reforms. So a huge part of the Progressive Era was actually reforming how people were elected and how involved the ordinary everyday people were. Now, on a national scale, the 17th Amendment was passed during this time period. So before 1913, state legislators chose the U.S. senators, not voters. And those who were part of the progressive movement argued that this system allowed corruption and didn't represent ordinary citizens fairly. And so the 17th Amendment was championed and directly mandates the election of senators by voters in each state. It's the method we used today. And this was a huge shift towards putting power back in the hands of individual, everyday, ordinary Americans. They now voted for their senators rather than having, people who were voted into state legislators choosing U.S. senators. All right. So you can kind of take a moment to think, this is really like, a personal choice, but which progressive reform was the most important? The direct primary, initiative and referendum, the recall, or the 17th Amendment? Most historians argue that the 17th Amendment was the biggest one. This was a federal law that permanently changed how U.S. senators were chosen. That's still in place today. All right. Other progressive era reforms. The commission system. Okay, this was adopted in Texas and was a new form of city government. It happened after a devastating hurricane in 1900 killed over 8,000 people. People lost faith in the corrupt old government. And so the commission system divided the city government among elected commissioners, with each one responsible for like a section. There was no single boss in charge of the city. And because of that, corruption drastically decreased. So, kind of like being represented by a group of people representing different sections rather than one person having a large amount of power over perhaps a larger city. The city manager system is also promoted by the progressives. Lots of change during this time. The city manager system of government separated the daily city operations from politics and political parties. Elected city councilors made laws, but they hired a city manager to handle the day-to-day operations of running the city. A city manager was typically an engineer or a businessman with practical experience, not a politician. Over 3,700 cities in the United States today use the city manager system. So separating the everyday running of the city outside of politics to get rid of the corruption. All right, scientific management and efficiency. Frederick Winslow Taylor believed factories could be made more efficient through scientific methods and wrote a book about it, all about maximizing worker productivity. Management would decide work routines, workers would simply do it. So this was about mass production efficiency, not necessarily beneficial to the individual. Some people benefited from higher pay linked to being more productive in their jobs, but if they were just paid hourly, this did not benefit them, but only their bosses. Pros and cons to everything. All right, and then we've mentioned this in another lesson, but social justice, the settlement house movement. This was a progressive era reform movement where women like Jane Addams and many other leaders created the settlement house movement, which were social justice homes providing services like social services, education, and healthcare to working class families and immigrants. And they became centers for community organization and social reform. All right. Child labor, I'm telling you, a lot going on during this time. Child labor. The National Child Labor Committee was formed. Okay, so in 1900, 1 out of every 6 children between the ages of 5 and 10 were working in factories. So a significant portion of the population. And the National Child Labor Committee was formed in 1904 to ban child labor. This was going on for quite some time, but again, during the Progressive Era, it was documented and brought to public attention. A photographer named Lewis Hine photographed and documented children's working conditions on a decade-long campaign. And by 1912, the president signed legislation creating the U.S. Children's Bureau. In 1916, the Keating-Owens Act prohibited the interstate trade of goods made with child labor, which significantly financially impacted everyone using child labor, right? If it's illegal to trade goods made with child labor is suddenly less effective for financial gain. Finally, it took until 1938 for the Fair Labor Standards Act to be created, outlawing child labor for children under 16. So we're looking at a 4-decade-long slow process to outlaw child labor and provide protection for small children working in factories. One of the turning points for wage workers was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This was a horrific fire in which 146 workers died in the blaze. Now, things that may horrify you, owners had blocked the doors and fire escapes to control workers and prevent them from unionizing. Okay, there was only one way in and out. And when the fire trapped them, there was no way to exit the building. Many workers jumped from the 8th floor trying to escape the fire, and there were eyewitnesses that documented this and told people exactly what happened. And so things that we probably take for granted today, like mandatory fire escapes, doors that, it's illegal to lock them because it's a safety issue in case you need to escape the building, a fire escape ladder, if you're high up, sprinklers, fire alarms. None of those things were required at this time. Horrible things like this had to happen, or I should say, horrible things like this is what spurred the creation of those laws to push for workers' sort of workplace safety. So Florence Kelley is a pretty famous name for workplace safety in the progressive movement. She was the general secretary of the National Consumers League, fighting against sweatshop labor. So she promoted things like an 8-hour workday law, specifically to protect women workers, was her focus. And the owners of the factories fiercely resisted that. But after the Triangle Fire, the public opinion was changed and they were kind of forced to put in safety laws and codes that protected workers. So these reform movements worked. They took time, but they worked. One reform movement that happened during the time period that did not last was the temperance movement. And so essentially the temperance movement was a movement to outlaw alcohol. And the 18th Amendment was eventually put into place in 1919, which prohibited alcohol nationwide, but it did not last. It was eventually overturned for a variety of reasons we'll talk about in another lesson. All right, let's see. It's getting kind of long, so we're gonna keep moving through here. I've got a couple more slides. So women's suffrage movement was also happening during this time. It had happened before, but it was still happening. Women had first demanded the right to vote as early as 1848. By 1900, a few states had granted women voting rights, but it was not a national right to vote. And so the National American Women's Suffrage Association organized hundreds of different chapters or groups within its organization, and various leaders used different strategies to push for a federal amendment to allow women to vote. The 1913 suffrage parade at Washington, D.C. became kind of a flashpoint or a high, no, I don't want to say a high point, but brought up a lot of attention because Black women faced segregation and violence, and it highlighted that. So eventually, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, and it was ratified in 1920, which gave women the right to vote. So it's only been a little over 100 years since women had the right to vote in the United States. All right. We're going to skip here just for the sake of time. So if you're interested in learning more about different progressive era movements, there's just a couple left here. The Silent Sentinels essentially were the more aggressive wing of the suffrage movement. When they were arrested, they would stage hunger strikes, and then they were force-fed by prison guards, which shocked the public and turned opinion in favor of women's voting rights. And so this was kind of talking about how civil disobedience could force political change. And then we also had African American leaders representing approaches to African American progress during this time. One side focused on self-improvement and economic success within segregation. Others believed that immediate agitation in political and civil rights was necessary, so a little bit more aggressive in calling for change. And so there was a wide variety of strategies within all of these different progressive era movements. So we're going to stop there for today.